Welcome to our Chapter 8 podcast on body cavities. Now, we're sort of going back in time. It's been a while since we looked at the early embryo, but if you look in this upper portion at our embryonic disc, remember when we left our embryonic disc, we had this horseshoe-shaped cavity that communicated with the extra embryonic coelom here as it curves around. Here we have the precordial plate, curves around by our precardiac region. And so this is going to be the beginnings of our body cavity. So this is largely where we're going to pick up. We're going to look at various cross sections in which we can see different regions where we dissect through the embryo. Here's more of a three-dimensional view, sort of showing where we're going to be forming our diaphragm, which is also going to help partition. Because we're going to take this horseshoe-shaped cavity and we're going to fold the embryo laterally. We're going to have the head fold coming around. And from this horseshoe-shaped cavity, we're going to create the thoracic cavity, within which we will have the pericardial cavity and our peritoneal or abdominal cavity. Now, as we look at our intraembryonic coelom, in the illustrations here as well as the animation to follow, you're going to see this horseshoe-shaped structure. And again, the artist is trying to make this three-dimensional. This is going to be our intraembryonic coelom, and the white line that you see is the communication with the extraembryonic coelom, comes into the intraembryonic coelom, curves around. This is going to be our pericardial region that we're going to develop, and it goes around on the other side. So as we look at the horseshoe, especially as the head begins to fold this around, we're going to form in the cranial portion here, this is going to be the pericardial area. This is going to be the peritoneal area, more inferiorly or caudally. In this narrowed, restricted region, this is going to be our pericardio-peritoneal canals that temporarily are going to interconnect the pericardial cavity with the peritoneal cavity. So as we look at our embryo, here we can see more or less a transparent sagittal view. But if we cut through these different planes of sections and look at our cross-sectional view, here we can see very high in this region of the pericardial cavity. By now, with our lateral folds coming around completely sealed off in this foregut region, we completely have this cavity surrounding the developing heart. Now, the developing heart is still connected back to the body proper by this membrane, which is referred to as the dorsal mesocardium or dorsal mesentery. As we move a little bit further down, still really in foregut region, we can see that we've got this pericardio-peritoneal canal. This is a little bit later in development, but that's what this would be synonymous with. But then in the middle region where we have our midgut, we have our umbilical cord, we have our connecting stalk, all these materials, we're going to have this open communication that's still going to persist. We're going to close that in last as we get, again, in our peritoneal cavity. And very low down, once we get past this down into the hindgut region, once again, here we see hindgut completely surrounded by peritoneal cavity. So for our intents and purposes, we're going to call this pericardial, we're going to call this peritoneal, and really in these regions, we're talking about our pericardio-peritoneal canals that we're developing. Now, before we really begin, as we take this horseshoe-shaped cavity and with the lateral folds bring them together, we're going to be working with really two mesodermal thin layers of cells. We call these mesothelium, and they're really going to be the peritoneum, the coverings. We're going to have that's on the body wall, the somatic portion, and we call that the parietal peritoneum. And that is attached to the viscera, or our developing gut, if you will. That's going to be the visceral wall or the visceral peritoneum. And you can see that as we have folded the embryo around laterally, we've brought these two arms of our horseshoe-shaped cavity together. We're going to form this around our developing gut, and the mesenteries are going to form the dorsal mesentery and the ventral mesentery. In many regions, this is going to be obliterated, but that's going to remain. Now, the mesentery that we mentioned, this is a double layer of your mesothelial lining, or the peritoneum. So we have the peritoneum from the right and the left side fused together to form the dorsal mesentery. And when this is the heart, we refer to this as the dorsal mesocardium. As we get to the stomach, we're going to refer to this as the dorsal mesogaster. In the intestines, we just refer to this as the mesentery proper. Now, the peritoneal cavity, this is this larger grouping. This is going to be the majority of that horseshoe. If we take away the pericardial and the pericardial-peritoneal canals, the rest of what we have is going to be in form, eventually, the pericardial cavity. As we mentioned, at the umbilicus, at the very ends of those horseshoe, we're going to see that communication with the intraembryonic coelom, with the extraembryonic coelom, and that's going to occur about 10 weeks. Now, that doesn't always happen. And in fact, as we look at the development of the gastrointestinal tract, we're going to see that the developing intestines grow faster than our abdominal area. So they're going to herniate out into the umbilical cord, and prior to this 10 weeks, they are going to retract back into the abdomen. If this doesn't happen and the closure doesn't happen, then you can have a newborn that is born with this herniation of the abdominal contents. Now, I know this looks horrific. However, this is fairly easy to resolve surgically with very little complication whatsoever. We just simply have a physiological herniation that didn't retract itself. You can put these back in fairly quickly, suture that up, and everybody's fine, typically. So, once again, here we're looking at our horseshoe-shaped coelom that we're going to be dealing with and working with. And now we'd like to put a little bit of this into motion before we start to partition these off. So please watch this animation. So as we look at our animation, we're going to start again with our flattened embryonic disc. You can see our neural ectoderm has folded. We've got our neural groove present. And now we're going to examine our intraembryonic coelom. Recall that this is going to be happening in our lateral mesoderm. We can see all of our different components here, our notochord. It's not a bad animation actually for neurulation. We're kind of missing the dorsolateral hinge points, but they do include neural crest cells that you're going to see form here in just a bit. So it's not a bad view, but there you can see in the lateral mesoderm the white space is forming. That's going to be our intraembryonic coelom out on the arms, if you will, of our horseshoe-shaped cavity that are forming. Now that's going to communicate with our extraembryonic coelom. They didn't quite split that open. But as we look at this overview from the amnion looking downward on top of our blue ectoderm, we're going to see sort of in that midline, we're going to have some white portions that are going to angle outward. And that's going to be the communication then with our extraembryonic coelom. There you can see that outward movement. You can see the arrows coming in and leaving at those common communication points. And you can see the divisions of those spaces. Here we can see that again, the flow of material in and out, especially at those lateral points of communication. This is the image that we saw in our text. There you can see that light pink colored intraembryonic coelom, the horseshoe shape. And once again, there are the arrows coming in from the outside, moving into our intraembryonic coelom. And you can even see the red heart there sort of wrapped around and a little bit behind the presumptive pericardial cavity that's forming. So now we're going to look in cross-section at the pericardial cavity. So now we're going to begin to partition off the pericardial cavity from the remainder of the peritoneal canals. And so what we have, since the head has folded down in our head fold, now our pericardial cavity is somewhat low down. This is going to be almost ventral at this point. So imagine the curve of the horseshoe being here and the pericardial peritoneal canals looping up and then starting toward the back of the embryo here in this cross section. Here you can see these are our pericardial peritoneal canals, and you can see that we're looping around the developing heart. Well, it's within these canals that we start to form these lateral ridges that you see. And at first, these lateral ridges are going to be our pleuropericardial folds. And they're going to be impinging upon it and restricting the flow of material from the pericardial cavity into our pericardial peritoneal canals to get back to the back part of the embryo. Well, these are going to thin further, and they're going to become our pleuropericardial membranes. So at first we have the folds, and this is going to begin that process of separating the lungs from the heart. and partitioning off the pericardial cavity from everything else. And then as they thin, as our thoracic cavity is ever expanding, here we can see the heart. And in this particular section, it is completely free within our pericardial cavity, although it probably still should be connected back to our dorsal mesentery at this point. But you can see, because of the growth of the lungs and the pleural cavity, as they begin to push downward, we're further refining this cavity, our pericardial cavity, and we'll completely separate this off. But now we've thinned out those folds enough that we now call them the pleuropericardial membrane. And you see how we're separating the heart area from the area of our lungs. This is going to continue to grow. Here we can see again, we're forming that pericardial cavity, pushing down and dividing off our pleural area. And it's almost like it's carving out this wedge that's going to completely separate this eventually. And it's going to form our outer pericardium. We call this the fibrous pericardium, or we call this our parietal pericardium. So there we have that split. We're going to be left with the mesoderm out here. This is going to be our thoracic wall musculature. And on the inside, we've got our parietal pericardium, or our fibrous pericardium. Now, here where we have fused the membranes together, right here in the midline, this is going to be our mediastinum. The mediastinum, almost think of that like an I-beam of tissue that's going to connect here in the ventral portion, connecting back through to our vertebral column. We're going to suspend our lungs off of it. That's where our heart initially was suspended from. Have the inferior vena cava here. We have the esophagus running through this. And so this primordial mediastinum is a very centralized structural unit of tissue that's present in the thoracic cavity. So that by this point, we have our pericardial cavity, have separated it from our what's going to be our pleural cavity. And if you've had comparative anatomy, in the shark, we have our pericardial cavity, and the other big cavity is referred to as our pleural peritoneal cavity. And that's really what we have left. Until we form the diaphragm, we're not going to further partition that off. The diaphragm is going to separate the pleural from the peritoneal cavities. Once again, there we have our mediastinum, the central core of tissue. It's largely used in gross anatomy, and by a lot of classical anatomists, they will use this term mediastinum as a structural location term to refer to all other structures within the thoracic cavity relative to the mediastinum. Put these all together, here's what we see an early stage with our pleuroperitoneal canals. There's our pleuropericardial folds. Then we get our pleuropericardial membrane. Again, we've got this division that's occurring because of the growth of the lungs and the formation of our pleural cavity. That's going to refine this until we have a completely self-contained fibrous pericardium that has a cardiac tissue within. Now, the next step that we're going to have is the division of the body and the formation of the lungs. But before we get to that, let's watch a video that illustrates the formation of the pericardial cavity and the separation of it from everything else. The composite structure that is the diaphragm is comprised of these component parts: the septum transversum, the pleuroperitoneal membranes, the dorsal mesentery of the esophagus. The esophagus is going to pass through the diaphragm, and the hole within the diaphragm that the esophagus passes through is called the hiatus. A hiatal hernia happens when the stomach herniates back into the pleural cavity through that hiatus. That's why it's called a hiatal hernia. And then we're also going to have the body wall musculature. This is almost going to get pulled away from the body and contribute to it. And we'll see part of this as we look at a video of the formation of the diaphragm in just a bit. But here we can see almost like a time-lapse image. We're looking here. This is going to be part of our septum transversum. It's going to become the central tendon. Here we have our pleuroperitoneal folds. These are our pericardio-peritoneal canals here. And then this is that dorsal mesentery of the esophagus. This is going to tie everything together. And so that when we get to the final finished mature form, again, we can see these holes. These are the remnants that are left with our pleuroperitoneal folds and membranes. These then openings, sometimes if you don't have these, you can have herniations and problems and herniation of abdominal contents into the thoracic cavity. That's called posterior lateral defects, because you can see it's on the posterior lateral portion. And then this is going to be body wall musculature that begins to get pulled in, that you can see here, and contributing to that part of the development of the diaphragm. Now this is going to assist in the diaphragm being much lower down in its connection, and we're going to have these sharp angular edges that are pulling down as the lungs grow and force that peritoneal, the pleural cavity down into this portion of the body. Again, we'll see that very well illustrated in our animation that's coming. So here in our diagram, we can see we've got our pericardial cavity. We have our peritoneal cavity. It's going to be in this region. Here's our narrowed pericardio-peritoneal canal, and this is the part that we're going to be closing off as we look at it in cross-section and in sagittal section. Now, we've got the pericardio-peritoneal canals, and we're going to see that those are going to be the last things to close. The muscle bundles that we see, these are going to be contributed from the body wall musculature as well, coming into this region of the mesentery of the esophagus. These are going to be the crura of the diaphragm. Now, these are small muscular bundles. We saw them in the previous image. We'll see them here in just a minute. These are also going to assist in the lowering of the diaphragm, not so much as we have seen with the diaphragm itself pulling down, but these are going to assist in that lowering, and when they relax, not going too far upward into the thoracic cavity. As we mentioned, those openings that are covered by the pleuroperitoneal membranes, if those do not form, if they're too large, if they don't close properly, that's where we get these dorsolateral defects that happen. And so that's happening in the dorsolateral portion of the diaphragm. Here we can see those muscular bundles tying in from the dorsal body wall musculature, tying into that dorsal mesentery of the esophagus, forming these two bands, or the crura of the diaphragm. Now, if we look at more of a coronal section now, as we see our lungs developing, here's our diaphragm, and we see it connected to the body wall musculature on the side. But as the lungs grow and they begin to descend, they're going to do so more in a lateral portion than in a medial portion. And you can see in the subsequent image, we have carved away some of that muscle and created a pocket down here on the side. This pocket on the side, these are the costodiaphragmatic recesses. And as that is sort of carved out by the developing lungs, this is going to cause the apparent descent of the attachment of the diaphragm much lower down in this peritoneal region, so that when these 2 points of contact here, when the diaphragm contracts, that's going to lower the floor of the diaphragm. If it remained at this point, when the diaphragm contracted, it would just pull the rib cages closer together. But because of this connection point much lower down here, because of the diaphragmatic recesses, that's going to cause this dome-shaped structure we know as the diaphragm to actually lower, and increasing the volume that we have in our pleural cavity, lowering the pressure so that we can inhale air. Now, just the last thing to mention, when we look at the nervous system control of what's going on with the diaphragm, that's going to be from the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve is a composite. Is coming from branches off the 3rd, 4th, and 5th cervical spinal nerve. And this is coming in so to cause the diaphragm to contract and relax in the appropriate manner so that we can effectively inhale and exhale during our respiratory cycle. Now, to finish up this podcast, let's put this together with a video showing the development and descent of the diaphragm.